Welcome to my new podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? With my guests, we are discussing health issues, questions you have about your health, and debunking some of the myths around our health. And it's an absolute pleasure today to be talking to Dr. Shema Tariq, Mothering Against the Odds, Surviving Infertility, Baby Loss, and Postnatal Depression. Shema is a Senior Research Fellow at University College London's Institute for Global Health and Honorary Consultant in HIV at Mortimer Market Centre. Her research focuses on health inequalities in HIV care. In 2014, Shema was awarded a prestigious Fulbright Scholarship to conduct HIV research at Columbia University. Since coming to UCL in 2015, Shema has built a program of work focusing on the health and well-being of women living with HIV. She leads the PRIME study, one of the largest studies in the world, exploring menopause among women living with HIV. So welcome, Shema.
Hi, Joyce. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So, as well as being a doctor, you have a master's in medical anthropology and epidemiology and a PhD in public health. That's a very impressive list of qualifications. So, I'd like to start by asking you about your career journey and how you decided to work on HIV.
Wow. So my career journey, all of it was unplanned. So this is not what I ever expected to do. And just before we came onto this call, we were chatting and I was telling you that I had a misspent youth in the 90s setting up warehouse techno parties. So I didn't think that I'd be a clinical academic at UCL. So I wasn't a particularly brilliant medical student. I was just very, very average, below average. I think when I qualified for medical school, when people were guessing what people might do or predicting what people might do 10 years down the line. And I remember someone saying I was most likely to be found on a yacht moored off the coast of Brazil writing for the Times Literary Supplement, so not being a doctor. So I was not a brilliant medical student. I qualified, thought I wanted to be a psychiatrist, and then decided to go off and do a little bit of A&E because I thought it's probably worth just doing, knowing how to manage some emergencies before I go off and be a psychiatrist. So I did some A&E and absolutely loved medicine. And I although I hadn't enjoyed being a medical student, what I realised very quickly is that I really, really loved being a doctor. And to everyone's surprise, I was quite good at it. So I did a lot of my medical sort of junior doctor training here in London, and kind of almost fell into a job. So I was quite good at what I was doing and almost fell into doing kidney medicine and intensive care, and was just about to go off and do that and sort of do my specialty training in that. And I sort of took a step back and thought, is this really what I want to do? Is that what I'm interested in? And I've always been quite political and interested in inequalities. And I thought really long and hard about what it is that I wanted to do in medicine. And kept coming back to HIV. And I think that's because I was 10 when the HIV pandemic hit in 85, 86. I remember the iceberg adverts. They had a really profound effect on me. I remember grown-ups talking about HIV in a very, very discriminatory way. And even as a 10-year-old, thinking that was grossly unfair. And then as a medical student in 1995, I was working on an infectious diseases ward up in Newcastle where I trained. And I saw young boys, same age as me, dying of HIV. And I knew, a year later, I knew that had they just survived for a year longer, that they would have lived. So that had quite a profound effect on me. So I went off and did HIV, infectious diseases, loved it, felt like I'd found my tribe. It's a really nice community of doctors and nurses to work in. And then, I got really bitten by the academic bug. I was always interested in writing, always interested in humanities, went off and did a master's in medical anthropology, came back and did some of my specialty training, decided I wanted to do a PhD, then decided to train as an epidemiologist. And what I do now is I combine numbers and stories in public health research. And I've been doing that for 15 years now. And yeah, I'm lucky. I have a fantastic job and I'm still really, really in love with it.
That's amazing, and many people have fallen into their jobs, all those little things that happen, such as, you know, you seeing those boys dying and really being
Yeah,
aware that leads people into what becomes their really lifelong passion. And I've
yeah.
heard you talk so many times about your research, and it's really fascinating and so important. And you've published many scientific and clinical papers, and you're invited to talk around the world on your speciality. Can you tell us more about the research that you've been doing?
Yeah, I think the work that I'm most known for is work around HIV in women. So it it's really important to remember that more than half of the global population of people living with HIV are women. And we often forget that. And certainly in the UK and other resource rich settings, women are often neglected when it comes to HIV research. So if you look at data on participation in HIV drug trials, women are the minority despite being the global majority. So, yeah, I guess since 2008, my work has really focused on um, supporting women living with HIV to achieve the best quality of life and best health possible, but throughout the life course. So I started off with my PhD, which was looking at HIV and pregnancy. I did a lot of work on how women engage in HIV care during pregnancy, whether they come back for HIV care after they've had their baby. I led a lot of work around infant feeding. So, did some of the UK's first qualitative research looking at how women living with HIV, how they felt about not being able to breastfeed their babies. Because at that time we were saying no woman living with HIV could breastfeed because there was a risk of transmission. After that, during this time, I also did some work on intimate partner violence amongst women living with HIV with some colleagues. And we found, and that's still, I think, the largest study ever done in the UK, we found that over half of women living with HIV had experienced partner violence in their lifetime. That's gone on to change guidelines. And most recently, I have led the PRIME study, which is an NIHR funded study looking at experiences of menopause amongst women living with HIV. No one had really looked at that before. There were a couple of us internationally doing it. Now it's become much more of a thing. And that's because up until relatively recently, there weren't large numbers of women living with HIV reaching menopausal age. And it's also, as you probably well know, Joyce, is menopause has never been seen as a particularly sexy area of research, although it is changing now. So yeah, a lot of my work over the past 8 years has been exploring how we can support women living with HIV to transition through menopause in a really positive way.
Yes, we've talked about sexy science before with some of the other guests, and for us researchers, the sexy science is what gets the grants. And
Yeah.
luckily now, women's health does seem to have come up in the sexy science
Yeah.
league table, and so hopefully things are being funded. And I've heard you talk before. Last year you did an event for International Women's Day, and I tuned in and learnt so much about some of the myths that I hadn't really understood were myths and weren't true. And you've mentioned some there about breastfeeding, and I think the HIV arena has changed so much over the last few decades. Can you tell us about some of the other myths that people might still think are true, and they've now been busted? They're not myths. They shouldn't be there.
Oh, yeah, I mean, we've just seen, if you think about HIV and just how fast the science has moved, it's been, it's amazing, really. Just like in my lifetime, I've seen it go from a disease that invariably killed people to one that is a long term manageable condition. So, people, yes, people do die of HIV. But if you have early diagnosis and you get on treatment promptly, you are likely to have a normal life expectancy. The days of having to take 10 tablets 3 times a day that give you awful side effects are long gone. For most of my patients, they take 1 tablet a day with minimal side effects. They are likely to die of other non-HIV related conditions. There's even some data to suggest that people living with HIV will live longer than those without HIV because they're coming in for regular checkups and they're seeing their HIV doctors and getting their blood pressure checked and getting their cholesterol checked. So I think that's really interesting. The other really, really important news to get out to people is around transmission. So somebody who is on HIV treatment who is undetectable, which means that the virus hasn't gone, but it's controlled and you can't really pick it up with blood tests. Someone who is undetectable cannot pass HIV on during sex at all, zero chance. We call that undetectable equals untransmittable. So U equals U. And I think that's a game changer. All that stigma that's directed to people living with HIV about potentially infecting other people, that should be totally challenged now, because U equals U means that people living with HIV can have sex without a condom and not pass it on. And I guess the last myth to try and bust is that women living with HIV can't have babies. So if you think back to the early days of the HIV epidemic, women were recommended to have terminations of pregnancy if they were living with HIV. Again, those days are gone. Women living with HIV who get pregnant, usually it's a planned pregnancy, even if it's not a planned pregnancy, as long as they're on treatment. And again, if they're undetectable at delivery, they can have a normal spontaneous vaginal delivery or for planned vaginal delivery. And the chances of them having a baby who acquires HIV is less than 0.5%.
That
So
that
yeah, loads and loads of progress.
that is amazing. So I was at university when HIV first came about, and we'd all been having unprotected sex. I can remember
Mm,
being at St Mary's having my HIV test done. That the drama a few years ago, It's a Sin. I can remember
yeah,
sitting in that corridor and
yeah,
thinking, am I going to have HIV? Am I going to have this death sentence?
yeah,
And I was working at a fertility clinic. And this was documented because we had a TV crew in. My boss was Robert Winston, who was very controversial at the time, and we had a TV crew in, and he was putting through a HIV patient, and actually it was totally workable, but
yeah.
the team hadn't really been told. They didn't know. They weren't up to date with the research about what they needed to do to protect themselves, and about the worry for the mother, potential mother, what they needed to do in the lab. So it wasn't really handled very well, but it just shows. I think the HIV um, issue has been one of our medical success stories, and you highlighted so many of the things there that have really, in a relatively short time, just totally changed this arena, which is such great news to hear.
Yeah, we need to be better at getting those good news stories out. And that's not to say that HIV doesn't have challenges. People living with HIV still face really difficult challenges, whether that's stigma and discrimination, whether it's now having to deal with lifelong sort of comorbidity. So people living with HIV have increased risk of other conditions such as diabetes, heart disease. So there are other challenges to face. But there are a lot of good news stories that I don't think we've been good enough at getting across, to be honest.
And I didn't realize till I spoke to you. So thank you for showing that. But we do want to talk today about mothering against the odds, surviving infertility,
Mm,
baby loss, and postnatal depression. And I invited you recently onto one of our International Women's Day events. I can't remember whether it was last year or the year before. I think it was 2 years ago.
it was 2 years
Where
ago, yeah.
it was 2 years ago, where we were talking about race and reproduction, and people can find that discussion still on YouTube, on my YouTube channel. But it was such a great discussion. But tell us about your journey with trying to have your family.
I mean, you know what? I'm going to start at the end because otherwise the story just sounds so difficult. So before I go back, I'd like to say that, I'm sitting here in a really privileged position, having come through that journey and come out of it with two healthy children, a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, who I can hear playing downstairs and who may burst in to have special guest appearance, Joyce. So my journey to parenthood was extremely complicated and difficult and painful. Although, clearly there's been joy at the end of it. And I speak very openly about it because a lot of the things that I encountered on the way are quite taboo. So I was quite ambivalent about whether I wanted to be a parent throughout most of my 30s. I was well aware of my biological clock. So this wasn't me not knowing about my fertility. I knew that by leaving it, I was sort of rolling the dice a bit. I was with my husband for a long time, so we were together from my early 30s, but I had decided that I wasn't ready. I was doing my PhD and I was ambivalent about having children. Then when we got married in 2014, I was 37, 38, and I decided, okay, now's the time. And I had deliberately left it late. At the time, I thought, you know what, the chances are that it's going to be difficult to conceive. But that's okay because there's always IVF. And I think that was my first mistake, was banking on IVF as that was my insurance policy. And I realised, looking back, how naive I was. I didn't really understand what IVF was. I don't think I really understand that it doesn't matter whether you go, if you're going for IVF, you're still dependent on your eggs. And, if your eggs age, they age. So, as I predicted, after 6 months of trying naturally, I wasn't pregnant. I was still not that worried. I thought, that's okay. I'll go and see my doctor and we'll get referred for IVF. And we did. And they fast-tracked us because of my age. And I had 2 cycles on the NHS and they absolutely floored me. I was physically, I've always managed IVF very easily. It hasn't bothered me. I haven't, I guess because I'm a doctor, injections don't bother me. Feel very sort of comfortable in medical spaces. The psychological toll of IVF was awful, actually. I mean, I can barely remember it now. I'm so glad to have left it behind, to be honest. Those 2 first cycles, I didn't produce any eggs. First cycle, I produced 1 egg and it didn't survive the next day to be fertilized. The second cycle was even worse. There were no eggs. And I still remember it was January 2016, going to see the doctor, and it was this lovely Indian doctor who I think probably similar age to me, who definitely sort of related and felt very sort of, she had tears in her eyes as she was trying to tell me that I would never conceive with my own eggs. And she's, so she said, look, you've got less than 1% chance of conceiving with your own eggs. We could do another cycle. You've got another cycle on the NHS, but in reality, it's not going to work. You need to be thinking about donor eggs. And she was crying and I wasn't crying. And I don't know why. And I've reflected on this a lot because for many women, that's an intense grief, to grieve the loss of, potential sort of future genetic child. I was always very pragmatic. My husband and I decided adoption wasn't for us. I think it is a great choice for some people, but it wasn't a good choice for us. Oh, that's one of my toddlers, Joyce. I'm sorry. He's going to burst in. Okay. Hello. Can Mummy do her work now?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mine have done some photobombing as well when I've been doing lives. Okay. I love it.
Felt like that BBC News reporter. I have to
You were very polite.
I didn't find, so being told that I needed to go for donor eggs wasn't a big deal for me. We decided adoption wasn't for us. It is right for some people. I hate the fact that when you can't have a baby, people immediately say, oh, it's fine, you can adopt. Like adoption is an easy option, because it's not. It's a very difficult path to go down. and that's not guaranteed either. It wasn't for us. So I knew that the only way of us becoming parents was to go for donor egg IVF. And I was cool with that. I didn't really have this sort of huge sort of need to have my own genetic child. I wanted to parent, I wanted to mother. I didn't particularly need that child to be genetically related to me. So we moved very quickly onto the donor egg IVF process. Um, it wasn't straightforward for us because we're a mixed race couple. My husband's white. I'm clearly Asian. Um, all the eggs in the UK at the time were from white women, white blonde haired women, and so I wanted any child to look a little bit like me. Um, so we did find one clinic that had eggs from an Asian donor. We registered with them. We went through. By this stage, we were in the private IVF arena, which comes with its own sort of difficulties and problems and expense. We got pregnant, I think, on my fourth. Yeah, so this would have been my fourth cycle. No, third. Yeah, fourth cycle of IVF. So second donor egg cycle, I got pregnant. And it's the first time I'd ever been pregnant. The Very early on, there were issues. Basically, when they scanned me at 5 or 6 weeks, it looked like the baby was sort of not developing in the way that they should do. They were worried about heartbeat. I was told that I was likely to miscarry. So there was a lot of anxiety around the pregnancy already. And then we made it to sort of 8 weeks and everyone was like, no, everything's fine. Yeah, baby's fine, baby's strong. And I just thought, right, okay. And I was nervous because IVF pregnancies, I mean, all pregnancies feel precious to people, but IVF pregnancies feel so precious because you can't just try again. It's, the stakes are so high. So I was already anxious. I was obsessively looking at this miscarriage calculator online. And every day I would put in stuff. And then we got to 12 weeks and I was like, at 12 weeks, your risk of miscarriage goes down to less than 1%. I went in for a scan, I think, at 14 weeks, and they said that some on the scan, some things didn't look quite right, but not to be worried about. I was put on some aspirin, and then 17 weeks, they scanned me and they said, there's something wrong with the baby. Baby isn't developing properly, severely growth restricted. We need to do, basically, I was told to have an amniocentesis there and then on the spot. So I had not expected any of this. And then suddenly they were sticking a needle into my belly to do an amnio and telling me that I had, risk of miscarriage because of the amnio. They sent us home. They took anyone who's been to antenatal clinic will know there's a special room that you're sent to if you're going to get bad news. So we went into that special room. And we were told to prepare ourselves that we will, the baby was likely to have severe chromosomal abnormalities and I'd probably need to have a termination or the baby would likely die. At this stage, we knew that's when we found out that we were going to have a boy. So 18 weeks pregnant, was told to just go home and wait for some results. For those 2 weeks, it was awful. I mean, I was just basically feeling like I was carrying a baby who was going to die. And that made me feel, I felt horrific about my body. I felt like, I'm carrying death. It was horrible. I remember getting on a train with my husband and someone stood up to give me their seat because I was very visibly pregnant at this stage. And I didn't want to sit down because I didn't feel like I deserved it because I wasn't really pregnant. I didn't feel like I was deserving of that kind of, care. And that was awful. I'd go to bed and I'd cradle my bump every night knowing that, we were going to lose the baby. It was horrific. The test came back negative, actually. Everything seemed, they couldn't find a reason for these problems. I went back in for another scan. And they said, oh, actually, the baby's growing, everything's looking better, but get yourself ready because you're likely to have a very, very preterm birth. So we were like, okay, it's all back on now. Maybe we're going to be all right. And then we were projected into, okay, we're going to have to deal with a baby who's born at 24, 25 weeks, which is a whole other ball game. But it's like, I can deal with that. And then very shortly after that, I was in town having my hair done. We were about to go on holiday to Italy. My obstetrician had told me to go on holiday. She was like, you've got to go and just enjoy yourself. I got up from being at the hairdresser's and I noticed that I was soaked through. And I didn't know what had happened. And I thought, have I wet myself? I mean, what's going on here? But surely I would have known. I couldn't control what was going on. And then I was so embarrassed. I just walked out of the hairdressers. And as I walked to the tube, I thought, shit, my waters are broken. And I knew there and then. It's like I'm 20 weeks pregnant. My waters are broken. My baby will not survive this. Got onto the tube, didn't say anything to anyone, just had to sit there. My waters were breaking. Phoned my husband, told him to pick me up at the other end. Had to get into a car and had to tell him. And I was like, my waters are broken and that means we'll lose the baby. We drove straight to the maternity ward. When in that situation, so two things there. I had to be induced because the risk of my waters staying broken were high in terms of me getting an infection that was going to be life-threatening. So they had to deliver the baby. So I had to be induced. I had to go through labour. Couldn't have a cesarean section because there is a risk that could compromise my future pregnancies. So I had to go through vaginal birth. And I had to deliver on a delivery suite, listening to other women having live babies. And so that's what I did over 3 days. I had a really difficult labour over 3 days. And my son, Altair, was born on the 10th of June, 2017. He was 20 weeks gestation and he was stillborn. And yeah, it's still one of the most, painful sort of life-defining moments.
I just want to give you a big hug. I mean, I've heard you tell us this before, obviously, and it how much can a couple cope with, all the infertility,
Yeah.
the realizing your own eggs, and yes, the emotional issues. We've done surveys asking women who have been through and men who have been through fertility treatment what made them stop, and number one is the emotional. It's people don't like, oh, we'll just do IVF, we'll just adopt. Those two things that you said are things that people throw out all the time.
Yeah.
And yes, I've been the other side of the IVF table, and I've had years of fertility treatment, and it's so hard. But then to add on there, you've got all the issues that you had during your scans, not knowing the results from the amnio, and then the miscarriage. I don't know how you and your husband, how did you cope with that? How did you get over that? I don't think you'll ever get over it. It's always there. It's, you said it is life defining and character defining, and it will always be there with you.
Yeah.
But how did you then get the strength to try again after everything you've been through?
I think I'm lucky. I have an amazing husband. We have a very, very strong relationship. We've been together for a long time by the time this had happened. And actually going through the IVF process had sort of really sort of solidified that. I was determined that
Sorry.
no problem. I was determined that that I didn't want my experience of motherhood to just be being a mum to a baby who died. I was really determined to be able to mother a living child. And I think my personality is I'm naturally extremely stubborn, and I just didn't really want to take no for an answer. So after Altair was born, his post-mortem showed that I had a very, very rare autoimmune condition. So basically, my body rejects the placenta, and it stuffs up the sort of placental blood vessels, which means it deprives the baby of nutrients. And this particular condition recurs in pregnancy almost 100% of the time. And it carries a very, very high risk, particularly of late pregnancy loss, so pregnancy loss beyond 18 weeks. So it's a particularly cruel condition to have, because a lot of people who have late pregnancy loss, like I had, it's usually a one-off thing, not a recurring thing. But yeah, so this was like heaping misery upon misery for us. I was originally told that there was no treatment, that we'd have to have surrogate, and I didn't want to go down the surrogacy line because I was thinking, I've already like had to give up quite a lot. This is one thing that I can't do. So being a doctor and being academic and being extremely stubborn, I decided to read every single paper on this condition. And then I wrote to every single expert. I emailed them and said, this is what's going on with me. I want to know, I kind of did like a mini systematic review. I was like, so this is what I think is probably the most likely combination of treatment to work. What do you think? And I was so lucky because I met this incredible professor of obstetrics up in Manchester, Alex Heasel. Still remember, he was at a conference, I think in Australia, and he phoned me as soon as he got my email from the conference to say, I can help you. I've had a few women with this condition who are on experimental treatment. And he was like, it's early days, but it looks like it's working. And I will never, ever, ever be able to thank him enough for doing that, and doing that on a Saturday. He didn't need to do that. So we put a plan in place. I got everyone on board. I went to see the best, the best of the best, the profs that, who knew everything about placental immunology. I learned everything I could about placental immunology. Lined up a new donor, although this time we had to travel to Cyprus to have egg donation because there were no eggs available in the UK for anybody who was brown. So we went to Cyprus, and my sixth cycle of IVF by this stage resulted in the little boy who just photobombed us, Paris, who's 4 and a bit now. And terribly, terribly anxious pregnancy, highly medicated, had to have scans every 2 weeks, had to travel to Manchester every month. I was, looking back, extremely unwell mentally during that pregnancy. So I had undiagnosed severe prenatal anxiety and probable post-traumatic stress disorder. But I didn't know it at the time and went undermanaged. So unsurprisingly, when Faris suddenly arrived, I wasn't prepared for him. I wasn't prepared. The end goal for me was just to have a baby who was born alive, and I hadn't really thought about the other bits of like, what do you do after the baby is born? How do you look after this living baby? And I just crashed basically as soon as he was born, and just got very, very severe postnatal depression, and can't really remember much of his first 6 months. Really, really difficult. But was able to advocate for myself, managed to get to see a psychiatrist, went on antidepressants, had therapy, did the therapy, have been on antidepressants since then, and, made a full recovery. But there was a final plot twist in all of this. So just as I was recovering from postnatal depression, my son was 7 months old, 8 months old. Yeah, 8 months old. And I just thought, I just don't feel right. I was just feeling a bit tired, a bit nauseous. Went to see my GP to have my smear test. GP said, oh, should we do pregnancy test? And we looked at each other and kind of laughed. Went, no, what's the point? I'd been told I could never conceive with my own eggs. So she went ahead and did my smear test. Still not feeling right. And then I thought, I'm going to have to go and see someone about this. And I thought, oh, you know what? I'll just do a pregnancy test because they are going to ask me to do one. And I can't remember when my last period was. And I thought, I was 43 and I was breastfeeding, so why would I have periods? So went upstairs, did a pregnancy test, found out I was pregnant. And I couldn't believe it because it's not like I would have had, I had a 7-month-old baby. I wasn't like having loads of sex. Plus, I was 43 and I was breastfeeding and I'd been told I could never conceive. I was left thinking, well, how pregnant am I? Because I don't remember when my last period was. Am I like 20 weeks pregnant? Actually I was horrified because I thought I've literally just recovered from postnatal depression. I really couldn't cope with a baby. What am I going to do now? Had a scan. I was 6 weeks pregnant. I went straight back on the medication, and 1st of April 2020, so end of the first week of the first lockdown in the UK, my daughter Lyra was born. And yeah, I'm in a very unusual position. There's a few of us that I know through Instagram who have a donor egg and an own egg conceived baby, and we have that. So yeah, uh, absolutely mad journey.
Shema, it really is. If you saw this in a drama on TV, you'd just think this is crazy.
Yeah,
Nothing
you
that
wouldn't
all
believe
those
it.
Yeah, you wouldn't believe. You
No.
think all those things couldn't happen. And actually, I don't know if you saw it, but there was a drama called Maternal, which is about three young
Oh,
female
yeah.
doctors that go back to work after having children. And actually, the Asian woman in it, she had adopted a child and then fell pregnant. I wonder if they listened to your story, but she didn't have all the other things that you went through. But uh, so, as a mother now, you have been through, honestly, I don't know, in all my experience, I've been working in fertility since 87. I have never, ever in my life heard someone that did mother against all odds.
Yeah.
Um, how are you feeling now?
You know what? I feel good now. I feel really good. It's taken a long time and hard work to get to this point. So, as I said, I still take antidepressants. I've had therapy for a long time. I have an amazing peer support group that I'm part of called Motherly Love, where it's a group of women who we all have kids similar ages and we've all experienced our own mental health issues, and they've become like my closest friends, some of them. Um, and I have some amazing friends who I made through social media during my IVF days, who are actually some of my best friends who I speak to every day. So I think combination of friends, therapy, medication, and my gorgeous children. They're 3 and 4 now, and we're over the baby years, which I found baby years really, really difficult. But I love having toddlers. Um, and I'm back at work, and I'm working full time, so I have a bit of time for me, and life's good. It's taken a while, but I feel like there was a shadow over our lives for such a long time. So from 2014, I would say, until this year, so nearly 10 years of sort of living a sort of half life. And yeah, the colours come back into our lives again. And it's, I'm eternally grateful for that.
And thank you so much. And it's so wonderful that we have people like you who are sharing their stories and talking about the ups and the downs, because life does throw ups and downs at many people, but
Mm.
some more than others. But thank you so much for relaying your story and how you did fight. Both of you fought so much to be parents. And it's a beautiful story. Now we're at the beautiful time. So it's a
Yeah,
beautiful story.
absolutely.
And you mentioned your tribe before, and you've mentioned social media, and I think having that support, and you did, which what I really think everyone needs to do. And just you didn't sit back on any of this. You looked, how can I help myself? How can I get through this? You got the treatments. I think it's hard for some of the public, with our NHS system as it is
Mm.
quite broken at the moment. But it's really important for them to do that and to find that support. But let's look at social media. So
Mm.
you've done a lot. You've done a lot on social media. How do you feel about it? We had a chat about this before we started, and for some of us, there are ups and downs. But I think it's really important that academics, health professionals, etc., share our work experience, which is what research we're doing, especially if it's like yours, which is so involved with the public, but also our personal journeys, if we want to, which you have done. So,
Yeah.
your experience with social media.
Oh, it's been almost sort of entirely positive. So I it's again, this has all happened very sort of organically for me. I started using Twitter in 2007, 2008, and just used it like messing around on Twitter, and slowly over time it's morphed into a very sort of professional Twitter account, and it's where I do a lot of sort of building my professional network, telling people about the work I do. What I often do is if we have a paper, I do a Twitter thread where I break down the paper and like do findings of the paper in very accessible ways. And that's been brilliant. And I have shared a bit of my personal life over the past few years because I've thought it's really important for me to be human as a doctor, as an academic. And a lot of the stuff that I talk about, a lot of the things that I have been through personally are taboo. So talking about baby loss, talking about IVF, talking about donor conception, talking about postnatal depression, I feel like it's really important for people to see that it can happen to anyone. It can, I think from the outside, people may perceive me as, having quite an easy life, having everything I could wish for. And I do have everything I could wish for now. But I think it's important for people to realize that there are other things going on as well, that, postnatal depression can look like this. It, it, it doesn't happen just to other people. So that's been really important. When I was going through IVF Instagram, which I think has changed a lot over the past couple of years, but sort of early days of Instagram, there was a really, really, really strong IVF community. And many of the girls that I was going through IVF with now are now close friends. And there was a baby loss community on there. And, I felt totally wrapped up in that community and supported. And it's been brilliant. And one of the things that's come out of me being on social media and being so open about our baby loss journey is that Tommy's, the baby charity, approached me to be on their board of trustees because I'd been doing so much stuff on social media. And that's been wonderful because that's given me a real platform to influence policy at a national level. So to actually take that experience and do something creative with it. So yeah, big advocate for social media. I think it's great.
And it's one of my mantras as well, to try and turn a negative situation around to something positive. And it's hard to do, but you've certainly done that, and it's really commendable. So thank you. So the podcast is called "Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This?" Now, have you heard in your very vast experience people say that, and what sort of things have they asked?
I think the thing that the thing that I most commonly hear at the moment is probably sort of reflection of what stage of life I'm at the moment. So two things. Firstly, from parenting groups, people saying, "Why didn't anyone tell me that having newborn babies is so hard? Like, why didn't anyone tell me that this is just like for the first year, it's just really, really hard?" And recently, friends have been saying, "Why don't people tell you that you kind of just have to grit your teeth, get through with it, get through it, and then it gets better and better?" So that's one thing, is just how difficult it is making that transition into parenthood, and it's not all lovely sort of trips outside with your baby in a pram cooing at them. The second thing, which we're talking a lot about sort of with my friends, so I'm just about to hit 47, and I went through menopause last year, and am now very happily on HRT. But most of my friends are sort of mid 40s, so we're all going through it. We're all perimenopausal at the moment, postmenopausal, and everyone's saying the same thing. Why didn't anyone tell us about this? And I'm sure you get this as well, Joyce. It's why did no one tell us about this earlier? And it was slightly different for me because I do menopause research, that I was totally prepared for it and kind of knew. But yeah, friends, that's what I hear about the most, is why didn't people tell me it could affect me in so many different ways? It's not just hot flushes.
Yeah, it's so much education. And actually, you brought up something I think is really important. You know, in the textbooks, and I found this when I was researching for my book, I just found too many myths that when you went back to the original research, they had been Chinese whispered along the way, and they've been extrapolated beyond recognition. And one of them is something that affects you. So the textbooks and the early papers will tell you that you lose your fertility 10 years before you go through menopause. But you had your daughter at 43 naturally. You went through the
Yeah,
menopause, so what, a few years later, handful of years
a couple
later.
of years later. Yeah,
So
2 years
and
later.
I'm hearing this more and more, and I'm going to start talking to my menopause experts about this, because I started saying, and when I talked about 8 to 10 years before, because I thought this 10 years isn't right. But you're absolutely an example, and I've seen many examples. So it's something that we really need to readdress. But yes, education on reproductive health. We are working on it. We've set up an
Yeah,
international group. We've got a UK group. We are working on it, and our international group have produced a teaching aid for teachers to talk about all of this, including menopause.
yeah.
And we are trialing it in September. It's been sort of one of my aims for, I've been on this project for about 5 or 6 years, and I'm so pleased we've now almost got our product in a way. It's going
Yeah.
to be open for consultation, hopefully any day on our ESHRA website. Hopefully by the time this is out, we'll be doing that. And the reason why it's been delayed slightly is because when I set up the international group, we called ourselves the International Fertility Education Initiative. But through all the work I've been doing in schools, we're not talking about having a baby. We're talking about reproductive health.
Mm.
So I hope by the time this goes out, it should be official that our international group is now being renamed the International Reproductive Health Education Collaboration. And the research, the education guide we've got for teachers, that's what it's called. It's called Reproductive Health Education. So we shouldn't be talking about fertility education in schools. It needs to be wrapped up
No.
in reproductive health. It needs to be LGBTQ plus inclusive, and it needs to appreciate people don't necessarily want a child, but things like puberty, endometriosis, PCOS, menopause, menstrual cycle, um, male cancers that can affect prostate, penis,
Yeah.
etc., female cancers. That's what we need to be teaching our young people. And yeah, menopause, all of it. We need to teach all of it. So that's what we've done. We've made it. We're That's not going to be that helpful for your friends, but it will for our kids. Our kids
Exactly.
hope. Well,
It's
actually, my kids will just but my kids know because I've taught them. But I'm hoping that for your kids, this will be embedded. This will be taught to them in a appropriate evidence based way with no myths, and we'll hopefully get to a good place. So
and
yeah,
regardless of gender as well. So,
yes. Oh,
regardless of gender, you're taught about menopause, you're taught about endometriosis. Honestly, it's going to do that. Yeah, I look forward to the next generation of smart kids.
some schools have asked me to teach the girls separately, and I'm no, the boys have got to hear.
I've
And
got to
and
hear
and I
it.
don't, it's not just about things that affect the girl. Anyway, it indirectly affects every boy and
Yeah,
every man. So
absolutely.
we cannot do this behind closed doors. So yeah. Anyway, so that's been so wonderful. I want to finish on some more sort of personal things. What
Mm.
you've done so much. We've talked in previous podcasts about juggling career and motherhood and your fight to become a mother. You know,
Mm.
you really went through so much. So what motivates you? I think this is a very hard question, but what motivates you?
Um, you know what? I am so lucky because I absolutely love my job. I wake up most days and I want to go to work, whether that's seeing my patients in clinic or whether it's doing my research. I am absolutely 100% driven by improving HIV and sexual health care for people. So yeah, that still energizes me, and I love it. And I feel very lucky to have found a job that I love so much.
That's terrific. When I give careers talks in schools, I say that's exactly it. You've got to have a job where you want to get out of bed every morning
Yeah,
and go and do it.
yeah.
That's really important. And I'm doing a lot about happiness. My next book, I hope, is going to be called Good Health and Happiness. And I'm very aware that some people have trouble finding happiness. I don't think they think about what makes them happy. So I've
Mm.
asked all my guests to give us a little bit of motivation. What makes you happy, and where is your happy place?
So what makes me happy? I love being in forests and in woodland. So I'm a real sort of really big believer in forest bathing, and have done a few forest bathing classes. And I'm lucky because I have a son who is also equally obsessed by forests and trees. So as a family, we go out every weekend and we go on long, long, long muddy walks in forests and hug trees and look at leaves and pick up ladybirds. And I absolutely love it. And it's something I didn't do before I had my children. It's something my children have really naturally led us to. So yeah, that's my happy space and happy place. And that's where I can sort of stop my brain from ticking over. So yeah, green space and forests.
I love that. And I think that I said this in my first podcast, which was talking about my life. We've got to let our brains be still.
Yeah.
And you're doing such a high profile job. It takes a lot of our energy, and I think that space to be still and green or blue
Yeah.
is great. And the very final question: you're a wise woman now. We get to that age where we
Yeah.
feel we were a wise woman. What
Yeah.
advice would you give your younger self?
I think one thing I would tell my younger self is to really make the most of having time to myself, and time alone. I was always so anxious to meet a partner and and then to have a family, that I think sometimes I forgot to actually enjoy the time and space alone, which I crave sometimes now. Anybody who's sort of, has a very busy life and busy family probably understands that. So it would be more, it's okay to be alone and enjoy that time alone, that actually there will come a point in your life where you won't have that. So yeah, that's what I
That's
tell my younger self.
that's beautiful. And for me, COVID taught me that.
Yeah.
COVID taught me to appreciate and have quality time on my own. Don't just sit on the
Yeah.
sofa and read a book or watch something on TV. Go and do great things. So I go to gigs on my own, go to the theatre on my own, and I've got
Yeah.
lots of friends, and I don't tell them, and I go. Well, they said, "Why
Yeah.
didn't you tell me?" And I was like, "I just want to be alone sometimes." So I think that's beautiful. That's really good.
And I've done that since having kids. I've gone when I've had trips abroad with work, I've taken myself off for an extra day to just, be in a new place totally alone. And I don't think I would have done that 20 years ago. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful to discover the world alone. So yeah, I think you're right. It's quality time, you know, on your own is actually a really good thing and nothing to be scared of.
I love it. Shima, thank you so much. You're an amazing person, and I do want to always give you a hug.
Thanks,
We've been
Joyce.
virtual for a long time. Thank you so much for spending the time talking to us. You've really told us so much. We've learned so much about HIV, but so much about mothering against all odds. So thank you so much for being my guest.
Thanks, Joyce. Thank you so much. And next time we'll meet in person and give each other a real life hug.
We will. We will. Thank you.